I wanted to give some thoughts on depersonalization, derealization disorder from the perspective of someone who's experienced it over their life and also as a therapist working with people experiencing this. We're not going to go a lot into the detail of depersonalization, derealization disorder. We'll just call it depersonalization disorder from now on. So if you want to look in and understand it a little bit more, I definitely recommend this book, and that is Overcoming Depersonalization and Feelings of Unreality, the second edition from Elaine Hunter and her team there writing that book. And then also from a more ACT perspective, Overcoming Depersonalization Disorder by Fuga Neziroglu and Catherine Donnelly. And then, for another perspective on the experience of it, I would go for Stranger to Myself. So Stranger to Myself by Jeffrey Abugal, which is a great book as well. So there's some key points I had in mind for this. One was that really, I think often people cluster depersonalization disorder as one thing, whereas I think actually my experience of it is there are many different versions of it, and they can relate to different sort of causal factors, presentations, and what can be helpful to work with them. And, let me tell you a little bit about my own experience very briefly, first of all. So I experienced this as a young child, very early memories of feeling depersonalized. I was given epilepsy diagnosis when I was a little kid. I was scanned and given medication, things like that for it. And really, I was presenting with depersonalization disorder, panic, anxiety, and OCD. But it was at that sort of severity. I primarily had transient episodes of it with panic attacks. It would either be the end result of a panic attack, or actually often it would be the thing that would cause the panic attack, and I'd have blends of it. And then I would have milder versions that would be more lasting. But then later in my life, I had longer episodes of this sort of more chronic episodes where it was with me 24/7 to varying degrees of intensity, varying degrees of impact on functioning and on distress. And this was at times related to other mental health challenges I was going through, OCD, particularly existential themed OCD. But at times it was also going on to antidepressants and coming off them. I experienced it both ends pretty severely. So I won't go into too much more detail, but just to give you an idea that I've had this over many decades and have experienced it both transiently, episodically, and more intensely and chronically at times for months. I never had it more than a few months. Like some people have had it, and have it for years. I moved in and out of it sort of through 2 or 3 month periods at times. And my own experience is that it could look very different. This blend of depersonalization, so the sense of myself being unreal or detached, fragmented. It's often very hard to put it into words. That's one of the things that characterizes it. It's very ineffable. So, it could be that side of it. It could also be more the derealization where the outside world is feeling more unreal and more detached, and like you're behind a screen, or like things are not, your senses aren't processing in a way that feels normal, distance, space, you feel off, things feel robotic. Your thinking can be disrupted. You can have what feels like a more blank mind, and it's hard to think. Or you can have anxious versions where your mind is actually more active. Um, and and really, there are so many different versions. People often always link it to anxiety, but I've actually worked with lots of people with depression that have this and have pretty low levels of anxiety, definitely the same as any average person, but very high levels of depression, and it's linked there. And I've even worked with people that don't really have too much anxiety or depression. It's more that it's just an annoyance, really, and a disruptor. And then the focus turns on to the depersonalization disorder. Um, so, things I've observed, and the books I mentioned do a really good job of sort of looking at the causes as far as we understand. And I think really we don't understand exactly what's going on is probably a fair way to put it. I think there are, let me say about some versions that I've seen. So I think there is, a subtype which is very related to panic disorder. And really, it's like we panic, 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 and then our body starts to detach to sort of prevent us. I think there are versions that are potentially more biophysiological. I even had it during COVID. Like the second time I had COVID, it started up depersonalization, for a morning quite strong. And then I tested and I had COVID. Nothing else had changed. I think people can get it from being depleted, stressed, overwhelmed, burnt out. Probably there are biophysiological triggers within us if, certain levels are not quite right in our system. I think certainly trauma can be very related to trauma. It is a trauma response. It's a way our system protects us when we can't fight and we can't do flight, then we'll freeze in different versions of freeze, and we'll have versions of feeling outside of our body and detached, and things are unreal, and our pain gets numbed, and certain adaptive things, if it's in the right dose at the right time, it gets us to freeze long enough that the predator might let us go, and then we can escape and run away, or it numbs the distress and the suffering to some degree, and then can be switched on afterwards. So, that can happen from big T traumas, like very significant single or multiple events, the types of things people think about with, uh, uh, war and natural disaster and physical attack and sexual assault and all of those types of traumas. But it can also happen from relational, ongoing, emotional abuse, physical abuse, neglect, small t trauma type relational invalidation and ongoing emotional neglect, that kind of thing. And, I think really can have a link to trauma, and we might not even really know what's happened in the past because we don't remember a lot of the past. So maybe at some point it got switched on, we don't even remember what happened to cause that, and then it's become a chronic thing. There's also a presentation where it can be drug induced. Different psychoactive drugs can cause it. As I said, I had it with antidepressants. I had it at times with alcohol and other experiences like that. It would trigger quite severe depersonalization. Um, that kind of sense. I'd look in the mirror and I wouldn't even be able to identify myself. I wouldn't feel like it was me or any sort of connection to that. And I would feel really outside my body and observing myself, sort of having conversations. And, I think there is overlap with OCD where um, sometimes there is a lot of checking, monitoring, ruminating about the symptoms, and all those mental compulsions are the things that actually keep it active and keep it switched on and turned on. I'm certainly not someone who's saying that's always the case, but I think that can be one of the mechanisms that's going on. And of course, who wouldn't do that when it's typically a very aversive state that people don't like the feeling of, and also think it will impact their functioning and their goals and where they want to go. So who wouldn't start to track and observe and see what's happening there? So I think there's definitely an overlap there with OCD, mental compulsions of checking the feelings, and attentional compulsions of sort of monitoring, but also rumination. So either ruminating and worrying and resenting and analyzing the experience and how to recover and things like that. Or existential rumination can actually just trigger this. If we spend long enough thinking about who am I, is there any point to life? What do I care about? What happens when we die? What is happiness? Am I connected to people? Am I, alone in this universe? All those sorts of things. If we ruminate and go round and round and round, eventually we'll start to feel detached from reality. So really, these are just some of the common ones, and there are others. I'm not going to list them all, but really the take home point is that it can show up in very different ways. And I personally don't like it when everyone kind of groups it all into one thing and goes, it's this, and this is how you treat it. Because even in my own life, I've had, 5 to 10, maybe, well, at least five different presentations of it that have been quite unique and related to more biophysiology, more OCD, more anxiety, trauma, difficulty. So, it can just show up very differently. Um, I think we don't know exactly the causes, as I said. My own sense of it is that, potentially there is epigenetics involved. In my family, there are actually a number of generations back, family members experiencing this. And you could say, okay, is that attachment based? Is that genetic based? I mean, people debate that, as I'm sure you all know, huge debates in that. I mean, the way I land is it's probably a bit of both, right? We have some genetic potential, and then epigenetics is where it's switched on by environment. And then, a lot of it is going to be experiences in the world and different levels of difficulty and attachment. And it doesn't have to be family, it could be school, peer, sibling, friendship, relationship. Um, Societal, cultural, the different levels we can get, traumatic experiences happening, or, overwhelming experiences happening. So that's a little bit of an introduction to it. And I think that I wanted to share a few ideas of what I think are helpful to work with this. So I'm a big advocate for acceptance and commitment therapy and compassion focused therapy, my two primary models. So I think both of these approaches have something to say and ideas and tools to help with this. Um, you know, on this channel, we use Russ Harris's ACT technique, dropping anchor, a lot because I think it's a really simple, focused, and depth, and it has a lot of depth to it. Actually, a lot of profundity in the ways you apply it and what's within it, and the ways you can adapt it. So that is my primary tool. The adaptation I like to make for this is with depersonalization disorder. I think typically we don't want to do a lot of sit-in meditation. I mean, some people will benefit from that and could do that and could sit, with great acceptance of what they're going through and find it beneficial and brilliant. I'm all for a person-centered approach. But most people I work with, actually, that's a lot to ask someone to do, to sort of sit with these experiences, and you can get feedback loops where actually it all intensifies because you're naturally pulled into an aversive monitoring of the feelings, and then it kind of blows up and becomes stronger, like putting a microphone by a speaker. You get the feedback loop and it becomes more intense. So I prefer to use drop-in anchor in life, and I like to make the adaptation that Russ Harris has talked about, where you make the acknowledge phase more brief. So you just acknowledge the experience of depersonalization, what it's like in your senses, what it's like in your sense of self, your thoughts and your feelings, or numbness, or anhedonia, or whatever the lack of feeling might be like. You briefly acknowledge that. You then spend more time coming back to your body in different ways. It could be very physical and active, or it could just be pushing your feet into the ground, taking a deep breath, stretching, even just feeling the contact points, so feeling the sense of contact. So you come back to the body, you spend a little bit longer doing that, and then even longer with engage. So it's all about engage. You try to engage in life, in the actions you're doing or the relationship you're in, and you do this with acceptance there as well, because as soon as you engage with depersonalization disorder, you are going to be experiencing derealization. As soon as you put your attention out, it's going to feel somewhat um, um, detached or unreal or fragmented, or not your normal experience. So we've got to have acceptance there together with engage. And that's hard. It's really difficult to do that, but you can build it up. You can do it more and more over time. So, and then you would loop through those, and you would use that throughout the day whenever the experience of depersonalization is starting to pull you out of your life, out of your relationships or your actions, then you would run through that technique and look on the channel and familiarize yourself with the different versions of dropping anchor, and then you engage. And as I said, it can interrelate with OCD, and OCD is characterized by intrusive, obsessive thoughts or sensations or impulses, and then the compulsions, the bit where we might do stuff out in the world, and we'll talk about that later, but the actual mental compulsions. So we're trying to use drop-in anchor here to interrupt those mental compulsions, so we do less scanning, ruminating, analyzing what we're experiencing, tracking, monitoring it, checking it, comparing it, resenting it, all of that sort of stuff. We do less of that, and we replace that with acknowledge. So like someone walking down the street, we're not judging, analyzing, resenting that person. We're just acknowledging them and then coming back to the path and where we're going. And we want to try and build that ability to do the same thing here, to switch that, judgmental awareness with a non-judgmental, accepting, compassionate awareness. And that takes time, and it's difficult to do that. Some of those mental compulsions are automatic, and I've heard, my ACT supervisor John Forsyth talks about depersonalization being like an automatic experiential avoidance or avoidance of difficult emotions process that can happen. So it's like automatically it's doing resistance and trying to, avoid and get away from difficulty. It's not something we're doing consciously. And in which case we need to train that automatic response out of ourselves by replacing it with acknowledging the experience and refocusing and engaging in life. The attentional mental compulsions, where we are scanning, monitoring, checking what we are feeling or what the external world is like. And then also the more analytical, ruminative compulsions, when we are resenting or worrying or analyzing or ruminating about why we're feeling what we're feeling and going round and round. And that all keeps the focus on the difficulty in the alarm system going, and the experience going. So we want to really try to disrupt that with our diffusion skills, this ability to watch the thoughts or step back and observe what the attention is doing, let go of the mental compulsions where we can, where we're actively analyzing or directing our attention in a monitoring, threat focused way, and change that to accepting or letting go of those judgment and analysis and resentment and these types of things. And then, we're then going into the present moment. So coming back to the engaged part, and as I said, with acceptance, because we're going to probably feel derealization, and we might also be judging how we're functioning. We might even not be able to talk quite as well or quite as clearly because our mind's a bit blank, or we feel a bit numb, or our words aren't coming out quite as well as we would. Well, just as best you can with compassion, just trying to speak still, trying to attend to the world with this sense of acceptance, and allowing it to be a bit weird for now. And in time, this experience will shift somewhat. And hopefully, as we get more and more, we'll be more diffused and more accepting. We won't even notice it, or it will dissipate as a side effect of the acceptance, or it'll come and go. My own experiences, I might feel it once in a while when I'm depleted, or like when I was ill, like I described with COVID, or even, sometimes at times of anxiety even, but it just doesn't take on the same grip and the same aversive quality. And even if it did set in, I would keep doing everything we're talking about in this video, and keep doing these skills repetitively, to get back into my life and to make the best of my situation, because either it's going to shift and move, or I don't want this thing disrupting my life as little as possible. And I don't want to turn the focus onto it, resent it, and compulse about it, and ruminate and check it. Instead, I want to get that focus out into my life and make the best I can. Much like if I had a headache, I don't want that headache to become the thing I give all my attention and thinking to, or tinnitus, or another sort of aversive experience that can disrupt, and chronic pain the same. Now, big caveat, easier said than done. Of course, I'm not saying that's easy or we just make that choice. We have to train that. We have to build that ability to do that. And it's hard. And the longer we've had it, the more intense it is, more chronic it is, of course, the harder it is going to be to do that. And it's going to be easier working with a therapist, someone who is experienced in this. Um, Other things we might want to do from ACT skills. So we really talked about diffusion, acceptance, using the drop in anchor practice to do that, present moment attention on valued actions and valued relationships. Um, we may well need to do more well-being stuff if we've got more the physiological version of it where there's not so much anxiety. There might still be some of the checking and ruminating going on, but there's less of the anxiety. It might be more depressive or more just irritating to have this feeling. Then yeah, we can take care of our well-being. We can try and get better sleep, and we got videos on sleep on this channel, ideas around that. We might want to work on our diet. We might want to work on exercise, time outdoors, but doing that with the goal of health and well-being and promoting that rather than trying to control DPDR. Because if we do it with that agenda, then our mind's always going to be checking and scanning. How is the DPDR going? Is it working? Oh, it's not working. And then suddenly we're into a lot more rumination and checking of what we're feeling. And it's going to drive the experience more so. So yeah, well-being activities are great. And social connection is a big one. So taking action on social connection. And now it's going to be hard. We're not going to feel as connected. We're not going to feel like we can talk in our normal sort of normal functional talking that we can do. Our thinking might be disturbed. We might not feel quite ourselves. But the key is to try to use the drop in anchor skills to get as much attention on other people as we can, really listening, really trying to focus on what we're saying. You can use the watch your mouth technique, which is on this channel in the assertiveness and relationship skills. So that's where we focus on what we're saying and as best we can, try to stay present with the words. But really, it's about getting the attention onto the present moment and the experience of listening and as best we can making sense. I mean, I had times where I felt like I couldn't understand people. At times I even felt like language was quite hard to grab hold of with this sort of thing. So at that point, it's just as best you can. It's not true that you totally can't understand people. If that's true, then that's more a medical problem and you need to get that checked out. But normally it's like it feels like I can't understand people and I'm not catching everything they're saying or as much. So you just as best you can compassionately try to follow where you can. And actually, the more you get your mind off the checking and monitoring how you're doing listening, actually suddenly you have more capacity to listen to people and to talk. So sometimes that stuff's made worse because of all the noise and the things we're doing in our head. So again, working on the compulsions that may drive it in some versions of DPDR. If you've got more of a physiological version and it's just happening, well, we want to treat it like the headache, like the tinnitus. We don't want that to put your life on hold as best you can, trying to listen and focus and connect with people. And related to this is values and having a connection with values. And the flip side of this pain, it tells us our values. So on the flip side of why this bothers us is we want to connect or we want to have an enjoyable life and we want to feel things and we want to do things and function in a high level way and stuff. We're often worrying it's disrupting us. And so, the value there is we want competency, we want to be good at things. So see if you can flip it around and get to core values, things like connection, things like presence, and savoring, and enjoyment, and fun, and effectiveness and competency, things like that. If you can get to those values, then think about how I can take actions to live in accordance with those values. What can I do carrying along DPDR with me for now and try to build up those action plans and schedule, your day and think about, what's the one small thing if I'm very debilitated by this condition, what's the one small thing I can do today? If I'm more functional, what can I do more of and get my attention into more? and sort of build up the behavior or the committed action, we'd call it, in ACT and in alignment with our values. I think something people often do with DPDR is start reading and thinking about it and being very in touch with the difficulty. The problem with that is that can fuel all the analysis, checking, compulsions, resentment, all of that sort of stuff. So a little goes a long way. Read a book, but don't read 20 books. Listen to a podcast, but don't listen to podcasts every day, all the time. Connect with people who also have this difficulty, talk about the pain, get some social support. We all need that. And talk about the goals you're making and what you're working on to try and improve your situation and the skills you're building. So it's about trying to find some balance in, educating yourself, but not keeping all your focus on the problem and the difficulty. Pick some other podcasts to listen to. It'd be much better to listen to one podcast on it, get a bit of understanding, and then start listening to comedy podcasts or podcasts around your interests, movies, music, books, culture, whatever it is. Like, pick something that you used to be interested in more, and engage with that. Same with reading. Read one book on it, but then start reading novels again. And reading can be difficult, and listening to things can be difficult because of the same things we were saying with how your cognitive process is not quite working as it would. So set a timer, just do a little bit, and as best you can, try to keep refocusing and using dropping anchor to refocus on what you're listening to, and just be kind and compassionate with yourself as you do that, and it will come back. Resentment can come up because we start to notice everything this is taken away from us, and that makes sense. Of course, you feel like this. It is really difficult. The more chronic and the higher the impact on your functioning, the higher the distress. Of course, you feel resentment to this thing, and it is really tough. Unfortunately, resentment fuels the difficulty, I would say. Certainly doesn't help us with recovery. So I think the thing is to treat resentment as another compulsion loop. Start to diffuse it, start to let go of it where you can, and start to refocus on values and actions instead. And then you'll go back into it, extend some compassion when resentment comes up. Of course, I resent this. This is really tough. I'm not alone in this. Many people going through this resent this, and I want to do the best I can to build my recovery plan up. So little goes a long way with those sort of support groups can be amazing, or they can be places where we ruminate on our difficulties. So try to find a way to engage with it where you do have good social connection, but you focus on what you're building and moving towards and trying to develop in terms of skills and actions and behavior. We've got to follow our values, not our mood. So our mood with this will tell us to avoid, it will tell us to maybe do the compulsions to understand it and ruminate about it more, or get support, or it'll tell us to keep thinking about these existential matters and try to figure them out, or research or read. And actually, we've got to go for, what are my values below this? Actually, the value of connection, that's what I've got to follow, or the value of mastery, and doing actions, even if I feel like this. Go and do that job interview or that audition, or go and meet those people, or go and play sports feeling like this, go and go to work feeling like this. Really, really try to engage in your life and bring this along for the ride, and follow the values and not the mood. It can be useful to see if there are any core fears under this. So if you go, why is it bad to feel like this? And then see if you can dig below that to another layer. Why is that bad? Why is that bad? And see how deep you get. And sometimes it gets to, I feel disconnected and I want to connect. Sometimes it gets to impact on functioning, things that matter to me, work, hobbies, things like that I want to be able to do well in. Sometimes there's health fears, existential fears. you know, we can group them into core fears around harm and danger, and and then core fears around happiness and impact on our life. And really, it's going to be something like that. So digging into those core fears and then building up diffusion acceptance. With that, you could do exposure work with a therapist who understands that, or using the Overcoming Derealization book, the one that was more acty that I mentioned at the beginning. That one has some exposure ideas in as well that you could look at and work on. You could look at the exposure, values-based exposure ideas on this video, and feel free to reach out and ask me about any of that stuff if you want to talk about it. So sometimes doing exposure to those core fears, it sort of shows our mind, actually, I can be flexible with that. I'm not so frightened of that, or I'm not frightened of the thought of that. I might still be frightened of the reality, but the thought of it I can handle and be with. And then we can, get our attention back into life because we've undermined some of that. I think compassion is huge. I think having self-compassion for this, extending compassion out into the world, doing kindness and things out there, getting the focus out there will help a lot. You could look at the compassion practices on this channel, the CFT practices. All of those will be helpful. Do smaller doses if they're triggering depersonalization, doing longer sits, then do smaller practice, do compassionate self-talk, do compassionate action. But generating a compassionate perspective towards yourself going through this is going to be very helpful, and was very helpful for me. um, I think that the idea of acceptance can be difficult for people. People don't like the idea of acceptance because it sounds like passive acceptance and resignation. We're talking about a more active acceptance where we're only accepting it so we can free up our attention and our cognitive capacity and our behavior to do things that matter. We're not passively going, oh, you just put up with it or resign yourself to it. No, we're accepting it because it's not workable to struggle with it. If we struggle with it, it pulls us in more. It's a downward spiral. It amplifies the symptoms and keeps us stuck in it, or makes it more aversive and difficult if it's more just a physiological version. So workability, tells us there that actually it's more workable to accept this in the service of values. So acceptance in act is always in the service of values and where we want to go and the life we want to build, even having this experience. And hopefully the side effect, and that's what ACT normally does, the increase of psychological flexibility means the side effect is that symptoms will often reduce. They'll get more transient, it'll come and go a bit more, it'll be less aversive when it's there, there'll be more space and distance from it, it won't impact your functioning so much. And ultimately, if we really get good at acceptance, it will start to pass, and it'll come and go, or it'll be more transient. And actually, transient depersonalization is really common. Many, if not most people, will have that at times. You'll hear actors saying, when I was performing, I had this out of body experience, or you hear athletes sort of describing that. And I'm not talking the flow absorption one, but they'll say, I was so stressed and I kind of felt like I was watching myself go through it. Lots of people will have a version of this. Of course, chronic and really adverse versions are much more difficult, but if we get that acceptance up, often it'll start to move back to that more transient version. Or if it's chronic, we're going to be more in our life. If we can really get our attention out into the things we value, really connect with them, then we'll start to forget about the chronic symptoms, and they'll go into the background more, as we do that. So yeah, just a few thoughts and ideas on depersonalization. Feel free to drop any comments below, and maybe more stuff to say on this, but this is just some of the initial ideas that come to my mind. Also, check out the existential OCD videos and other ideas we have on the channel. And look at the skills playlist, the depression playlist, the OCD playlist, because there is overlap with OCD sometimes here, and compassion playlist. And yeah, give it a shot. If it's really difficult, get out there and get a therapist who understands this, that knows either CBT for depersonalization, ACT for depersonalization. Maybe they know some trauma models, things like that, but they know that this is a nuanced thing, and that yes, some of it may be rooted in the past, but it also might be to do with what's happening in the present and skills that we need to use here. So get out there and find someone, and yeah, don't listen to your mind when it says it's hopeless. It's all, there is always hope. Our brains can always adapt and grow and build new capacities, and we can build up our ability to be with adversity and difficulty. And in doing so, the side effect will be that things either get easier or it will start to pass. So there's always hope, and you can do it, but sometimes we have to be persistent, committed, practice over and over and over again on a bad day. Just keep doing the skills until we feel somewhat more engaged and connected in life. And if we have that gentle relentlessness, we'll start to see more connection with values in life again.